Okay, so in terms of this idea of measuring sleep, so we have this sort of classification of measuring the physiological responses of sleep. So physiological just meaning, relating to the body ultimately. So we've got three of these sorts of devices. So the first of these is an EEG. So we can see here they have quite long names. The rule of thumb is if they are shortened or abbreviated on the study design, you can refer to it as that abbreviation. So, for example, if I had a short answer question, on the study design, the electroencephalograph is written just like we've got in pink here, electroencephalograph in brackets EEG. That's how it's written on the study design. It's got that little EEG acronym on the study design. Therefore, say I'm in the exam and I'm about to write about an EEG, I can just call it an EEG. I don't have to say electroencephalograph in brackets EEG, blah, blah, blah. I can just say EEG because VCA has abbreviated it on the study design. The opposite example of this is when there might be a common acronym, but it's not outlined on the study design. So for example, with classical conditioning, I believe. So, you might be talking about the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus, and we often shorten that to UCS or NS, but VCAR doesn't abbreviate it like that on the study design. Therefore, if I was to answer a question and I want to use, UCS, let's say it's quite a long question, so I'm going to be saying UCS a lot of times. I obviously don't want to be writing out unconditioned stimulus, because it's just a waste of time. In that case, I have to define it first. So I would write unconditioned stimulus in brackets UCS, and then from then on in that question, I can just call it a UCS. I don't have to write out the full thing. Hopefully that makes sense. So the rule of thumb is if it's shortened on the study design, you don't have to define it and shorten it yourself. If it's not an acronym on the study design, you have to write it out first, because technically, if you were to just write UCS, VCAR, the idea is that, they don't know what you're talking about. They might not know, you might think unconditioned stimulus stands for something else. So I don't know, it might depend how nitpicky your examiner is, but just to be safe, always do that. That's the general kind of rule to go by. Okay, so moving aside from that, in terms of what we're actually looking at, so your EEG, your EMG, and your EOG, they're measuring these physiological responses of the body. So they're detecting the electrical activity of these three separate things. So the EEG is measuring the activity of your brain. The EMG is detecting the activity of your muscles, and the EOG is ultimately detecting the movement of your eyes, but it does that by detecting the muscles that control eye movements. So with these, the whole idea is, obviously they're called electromyograph, electrooculograph. We're thinking about electrical activity. It's how they pick up information. With the eyes, your eyes, aren't, conducting that electrical activity. So they observe or detect the electrical activity of the muscles that control the movement of your eyes. So it's kind of an indirect way. It's really important to write that in your questions. If you write detects, amplifies, and records electrical activity of the eyes, that's incorrect because it's not recording electrical activity of the eyes. If you've seen, they use electrodes. So, when, like with an EEG, you have the electrodes kind of all over the brain. With an EOG, you have them sort of like around the eyes because, again, it's the muscles. If you were to say detects, amplifies, and records electrical activity of the eyes, that would almost imply that you're putting electrodes on the eyeballs. So again, it's just a bit of a nitpicky thing. This is probably the most specific psych gets. Like usually, they're very lenient with the terms you use and things like that. And, just what I was saying before about how nothing's really very definition based and, knowing the definition of specific terms isn't such a huge thing. But in this case, it is so important that you always use this acronym. You have to always use these terms. Detects, amplifies, and records electrical activity. Always use that. I don't know why, but VCAR just very, very picky when it comes to this. So EEG, dare of the brain. EMG is dare of the muscles. So generally think about muscles in the body. And then the EOG is specifically the muscles that control eye movements. So we'll talk about the stages of sleep in terms of REM and NREM. Those are your two major stages. The idea is that with the three of these, you can kind of detect what stage or sort of how deep someone is sleeping based on these. So we'll come back to this idea when we go through them, but it's just really important to understand that you've got brain, muscles, and muscles that control eye movements. The way I used to remember this is EOG. So the O looks like an eyeball. So that's how I remember it's an eye. Or if you can remember oculo, again, think of an eye. And then EMG, M for muscles. And then I just remember that EEG is the one that's left over. So the brain. Yeah, really, really important. Again, just overemphasizing this idea of detects, amplifies, and records electrical activity. Make sure you know that. So the other two methods we have of measuring sleep are a little bit more subjective. So this is self-reporting or sleep diaries. So if you have someone that's doing a sleep study, so you'll hook them up to all of these sort of electrodes. And that's obviously a little bit more objective because it's very scientific. What's recorded is what's recorded. The graph that it gives you, it's the data that it gives you. So that's quite objective. Whereas with sleep diaries and video monitoring, these are a little bit more subjective because they're sort of open to interpretation. They don't directly tell us information relating to sleep. So with the sleep diary, obviously the person is, noting their own experiences. That can be very subjective. It's very open to bias. It's obviously very helpful because, you can't use electrodes to figure out how a person was feeling before bed or, what the stresses of the day were or, how refreshed they feel upon waking. Those are some really important things that a sleep diary is good for. But it's just important to understand that, they may get the same hours of sleep. They may be technically, as in two different people may be technically the same level of refreshed, but based on their personal experiences, one may think, oh no, I still feel exhausted, I'm still tired. One may think, oh, I'm so refreshed, I'm the freshest I've ever been. So it's this idea of just being aware that it's not a very objective, i.e. it's subjective, and that, interpretations will differ slightly. So with video monitoring, it's kind of the same thing. You basically just video someone while they're asleep. And this is sort of when you're looking for things like maybe seizures or sleepwalking, that sort of thing. And the idea of it being subjective is just because, again, it's a little bit open to interpretation. So this idea of if someone's moving a lot, what that says about their sleep. Oh, they must be having a bad sleep. It must be this, that. So I would say it's probably less subjective than self-reporting because the video is in front of you. But it relies on the person that's watching the video to interpret what they think is going on. And that's why it's a little bit more subjective as opposed to your electrodes. They produce graphs that have little waves on them. And then that's what it is. It's kind of data. It's more, objective sort of. I know it's not technically numbers, but a little bit more numerical data.